Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. If you grew up on Cold War cinema and 8-bit dreams like I did, then you already know the feeling. That first wide shot inside NORAD, a cathedral of glass and raster glow, and those enormous, eerily beautiful vector maps that somehow seemed alive. For my money, those screens were a full-on character in the movie WarGames. Let's have a look.
It's learning.
And that's what you get for encrypting your launch codes with DES. Now, the plot gave us teenage chutzpah and DEFCON drama, but it was the set design that gave us the techno-mythology. Here's the twist, though. Those big NORAD screens weren't raster at all. They were drawn, quite literally, on a lab-grade vector display, the HP 1345A. And because the 1345A is monochrome, the production team did it the hard way. Render separate color passes on film and stack them with filters until the blue-green arcade aesthetic clicked into place. The animations came from the Hewlett-Packard 9845C computers driving the 1345As, recorded one frame at a time through color filters. 1 minute per frame, 7 months of negatives. Old-school visual effects, line by line. That's the mythology. Today we're going to build the reality, our own little slice of Cheyenne Mountain. Not the nukes, mind you, just the glow. We'll resurrect a real HP 1345A here in the shop, wire it to a modern microcontroller, and teach it to draw. Along the way, we'll discover why analog vector displays still feel like sci-fi, how 1980s handshakes beat 2020's latency when you do them right, and why a certain optional board turns simple into interesting. Let me get you into the headspace. A vector display doesn't scan lines like your TV does. There's no horizontal retrace, no vertical blanking. You position an electron beam anywhere on the phosphor and you trace your geometry directly to it. If you watch a typical television CRT draw its image in super slow motion, you'd see it drawing each horizontal line across the screen and working its way down, eventually filling the entire screen with pixels. But a vector display just points, turns on, draws a precise line directly to another point on the screen, and then turns back off. There are no pixels. As such, there's no moire patterns where lines intersect, and you never have to anti-alias for jaggies. The display is pure and linear. The only thing it can't do, really, is to fill in blocks. Everything is wireframe by its nature. Now, I don't have a camera fast enough to capture an example of a vector actually drawing on the screen, but the slow-mo guys did it on a Tempest machine a few years back, so I'll hoist a few seconds of their content to show you precisely how the vector beam draws. As you can see, it doesn't scan, it draws each line one by one until the picture is complete, and then it starts over. On a vector display, there are no pixels. The one exception to this is a color vector display like the Wells Gardner 6100 that you'll find in a Tempest machine. Because CRTs, if they're color, require a shadow mask to produce that color, you're limited by the resolution of that mask. But on a monochrome vector display, though, you can zoom right in on a line and it's pure, no pixelization, because it's drawn by the electron gun directly into the phosphor on the screen. But while the display is infinitely precise, the electronics that control the gun are going to have some practical limitations. In our case, the 1345A gives you a Cartesian space, 11 bits per axis under the hood, and a command interface that's almost smug in its minimalism. There are just 4 commands: plot, graph, text, and set. Everything else is data. You send 16 bits at a time, and the display interprets them, swings the beam around, and burns lines directly into your optic nerve. Of course, myth becomes maintenance very quickly when your first eBay special arrives dead like mine did. Then the second one showed up literally crushed. Chassis caved in like a soda can, and irony being alive and well, it actually worked for at least a day, and then I sent that one back on principle and waited for number 3. Now, lab gear wasn't built for living rooms, and the 1345A reminds you of that at its first contact. It doesn't just plug into AC off the wall, it wants minus 15 volts, plus 15 volts, and 5 volts, with the 5 volts carrying most of the current. So I grabbed a Meanwell triple output supply, did the pin dance on a very particular 6-pin AMP Molex style shell, and promptly ordered the wrong side of the connector. I was very careful to look up all the correct part numbers and order exactly what was on the display, but of course I needed the other gender to plug into it, so I got it backwards. And that's how you get a week of staring at a perfect, useless plug while the male completes your education for you. Once the right pins finally arrived, I got to play Toolmaker. Tubular crimp contacts, the exact die set, and the sort of patience that only comes from having to redo it 3 times. The power-up was gratifying, though. The 1345A is clever enough to self-test when there's no data cable attached, so a proper startup gives you a hardware-generated test pattern. And mine came up bright, but the line work had a telltale wobble. Each vector was rotated a hair counterclockwise relative to its neighbor, so the lines didn't actually meet. Even text looked a little drunk. On the vector arcade boards, you hunt for XY linearity and maybe rotation trimmers. The HP manual gives you a couple of dozen different adjustments, none of them labeled rotation. Welcome to the 1980s. So I walked the pots one by one, moving only what was obviously out of spec. And about a dozen in, I hit the jackpot, a control that tightened the rotation air of the individual vectors. And one pass later, I had a crisp, continuous grid and a font that looked like it meant it. The next mission was to actually talk to the thing. Now, back in the day, they would have used an HP 9345A computer to actually drive it. Now, I've heard of them, but they're rare enough that I've never seen one. And they're in demand enough that when they do come up for sale, they're normally several $1,000s. So, necessity and cheapness being the mother of invention, I wanted to see if I could do it with a $2 microcontroller. I wanted to go the modern hackers route, an ESP32 acting as a USB to parallel bus bridge. On the back panel of the 1345A is a 26-pin digital input, D0 to D15 for data, RFD and data valid for handshaking, grounds and supplies, and a few don't touch them unless you know you're doing lines. Now, this bus is old school, unbuffered and unterminated, so you need to keep your cables short and your edges polite. The protocol itself is deceptively simple. The display drags ready for data low when it can accept a word. You place 16 bits on D0 to D15, and then you assert data valid low. The display latches the word in, and then you release data valid. Rinse and repeat. Low is true on both lines. You have to pull them down. And because the 704 memory option uses bit 15, the base unit effectively treats D0 to D14 as the payload. Only simple is relative. My good display never asserted RFD at all. Internal pull-ups, pull-downs, external bias, I tried everything, and I'm not an engineer, but nothing made that line move. It was as if the handshake pin wasn't even connected, or it went to Nebraska, or who knows what. So out of desperation, I tried the dead unit, the one with no visible display, and it talked back. I couldn't see the result, but the bus actually responded. So it's time to mix and match. Now, my working chassis had the optional 704 vector memory board installed. The documentation says the 704 adds a 4K by 16 vector memory buffer that the display can loop autonomously, and in some modes, it changes how the input path is interpreted. And so I carefully pulled out the 704 option board, but there was no change. Now, the rumor you'll hear online and through ChatGPT is that the RFD and data valid don't behave the same with the 704 installed, but I found it cleaner to swap the entire vector processor board from the chatty but dark unit into the bright but silent unit, and that worked. Suddenly, I had one 1345A that lit up and took orders. If you've never driven a vector display, the first 10 minutes are a masterclass in humility. You don't draw a line. You load an absolute start coordinate, you tell the beam to go pen down, and then you feed it the end coordinate. Get a bit order wrong, and you'll swear the machine is haunted. Diagonal slashes where horizontal lines should be, or vice versa. I spent a solid evening sending XY pairs, trying to get all 4 corners to prove that my axes weren't mirrored, and then I coaxed a box into existence finally. For a while, I could only make lines at 45 degrees, which is geometry's way of telling you that your X and Y paths aren't latched when you think they are. But once box is obeyed, I put an X in the box, and then a mesh, and then the simple dopamine hits. Lisa Ju-style spirographs, cubes that you can spin in 2D, and star fields. Those first effects ran entirely on the ESP32, dumped word by word into the HP. But the long-term plan was to make the 1345A a controllable target from any box with a serial port. So I wrote a small Python host that speaks a binary protocol over USB serial to the ESP32, which then faithfully asserts the 16-bit parallel interface with the proper RFD and DAV timing handshake. The ESP32 was responsible for being polite on the bus, tri-stating data between words and not outrunning the display's internal vector engine. From the Python's point of view, you're just writing 16-bit words as if you're clucking a first-in, first-out list, then you optionally tag a draw it once or draw it in a loop flag. The loop mode is a wink and a nod that I added for the option 704 experience. Send the geometry once and then let the display refresh it locally while you think about something else. HP shipped that capability 40 years ago in the form of a full add-on board, and it's still the right answer in 2026 for many effects, even if just done in software. It turns out that the 704 memory option is pretty rare, at least on eBay, so my project would actually help make a lot of HP units suddenly useful. At this point, a star field felt kind of mandatory, and it became the idle screen quietly drifting on when no data is arriving. Then came test cases ported to Python so that I could iterate faster. And then, because if you hand a vector display to a certain kind of person, it's inevitable, I grafted in a Python implementation of Asteroids. This is a case where I vibe coded my way to success. I found a Python implementation of Asteroids on GitHub, pointed codecs at it, and told it to integrate the game into my test app. It thought and worked for about 15 minutes, and it did an admirable job. Now, I had to tell it that the flying saucer was upside down and tell it to make the rocks much bigger and so on, but otherwise it actually nailed it. The game looks pretty authentic because the game was, of course, originally also a monochrome vector XY display. As such, you can do a few special effects. To make the shots look really intense, I draw each of them 4 times per frame, thus saturating the phosphor at those points. I do the same for the little explosions, and it's kind of a nice effect. Let's talk about line budget, because the 1345A is happiest when you respect physics. If your scene takes too many vectors to refresh at a readable rate, your beautiful neon world becomes kind of a flicker fest. The HP side of the story is merciful. It addresses a 2048 by 2048 grid, so each coordinate is effectively 11 bits per axis, and the interface is 16-bit words. In the common formats, you'll send at least one 16-bit command per vector plus enough words to carry the 2 endpoints. If you were a perfect packer, you'd need 22 bits per segment, which rounds to 3 16-bit words. Add the command word and you're at 64 bits per vector, best case. If you drive pen up to start and pen down to end as separate operations, which in practice you often do for non-contiguous segments, you're closer to 128 bits per segment. And now the math is easy. At 19.2, which is as fast as I can get a PDP-11 to go, and a pretty classic serial rate, you can deliver about 150 to 300 vectors per second. But at 30 frames per second, that's only 10 vectors. Crank the length to 921/600, and now you're up to about 10,000 vectors per second, which turns out to be pretty close to the limits of the vector writing rate. Now, those are pure transport ceilings. In practice, you'll lose a little to framing and software overhead, but it's the right order of magnitude. So if you draw a wireframe cube with 12 edges, that's easy at 150 vectors a second. Draw a dense star field of 1,000 line segments, well, you want a high baud rate path or a retained vector trick. And yes, the HP's option 704 does exist to make this a non-problem by looping locally on a 4K word buffer so you don't have to shovel the geometry every frame, but at some point the display can only draw so many vectors so fast, no matter how they are supplied. I built mine with a 26-pin ribbon cable breakout and a breadboard. At some point, I'll build a PCB that serves and looks like a little adapter dongle that just plugs into the HP's data port and then has a USB port, but for now, the breadboard solution works fine. And now for the most fun bit of archaeology. Why the 1345A in a movie set was both genius and hard work. Well, because it's monochrome, the production team rendered each color as a separate pass, still filming the 1345A through different filters and compositing the results. And that's why your lines look so pure. You're watching a high-res vector CRT burn straight into a negative, not a camera pointed at a TV. Colin Cantwell, yes, the same production design legend who touched Star Wars and 2001, led the screen content effort, and they used, as I said, HP 9845C machines to generate the scenes. Now, the 9845 has a little display, but its own resolution wasn't enough to film, so the images were rendered on the high-resolution vector display, the 1345A, for the camera. It's a glorious hack, and it's aged better than a lot of CGI. Now, with our little NORAD now alive and on the bench, I wanted to feed it something historically accurate. And that's where the Tektronix 4014 enters the chat. I picked up one of these a couple months ago, and it's not working yet, but I have big hopes for it. The Tech 4014 was a vector terminal from the mid-70s with a direct view storage tube. Storage matters. The phosphor actually remembers the line until you wipe the entire tube. So there's no refresh loop. You draw and it stays. There's like a mesh behind the phosphor that keeps it active. The 1345A, by contrast, is an electrostatic CRT without any kind of storage. So if you want the lines to persist, you refresh them on the host or with the 704 buffer or with your own loop. The machine room distinction is huge. Tecternal is exported an almost print-and-forget model, while the HP is a live instrument. I wrote a utility to ingest Tektronix 4014 style plot files and then translate them into my HP words. The demo that made me grin the most was a tech-era map of the United States rendered on the 1345A and then looped. And that's where the difference between retained vector and HP's looping system pops right out at your eyeballs, as it flickers quite a bit on the live display. There's just too many vectors to draw the entire map with any detail. Now, in the process of decoding all this, you get intimate with the 1345A's command set. Plot moves the beam, graph draws with it down, text draws characters using an internal generator that gives the HP look, a font just different enough from the arcade vector titles that you can feel it. Now, before we kill the shop lights and have a look, a little coda on Hollywood versus reality. The real NORAD facilities inside the Cheyenne Mountain complex never quite look like John Badham's set. The film's wall was deliberately hyper-bright so it could be photographed live. But the vector magic that you saw was real enough, born of the same hardware that we just coaxed back to life. It's the best kind of movie trick, one that respects the physics of electron beams and phosphor, if not scale. The cool part is that you could hand this 1345A to a 2026 cinematographer, and they would still get a vintage look that no plug-in can fake. Here's a little demo of some of the best effects.
This is the future. Evolution. This is the future. Evolution.
Remember, I'm mostly in this for the subs and likes, so if you found today's mix of popcorn and protocol interesting, I'd be honored if you'd leave me one of each before you go today. Get subscribed, and if you're already subscribed, double check to see that you really still are, because sometimes you get unsubscribed. Here's a link to another one of my videos that the algorithm thinks you'll enjoy. Check it out. In the meantime and in between time, I hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage.